Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Stebby. Today is a Stashing with Stephanie Day where we take a brand new fat quarter friendly pattern and make it up here on the video. The patterns are always free for our Stashing with Stephanie subscribers, but you can also purchase them separately if you're not a member. Real quick before we get into this one, I'm super excited about it. I always say that, but I really like the way that this pattern has come together. It kind of looks like a giant X. And we have written the instructions so that no matter what size quilt you choose, it's going to look like a giant X. So it will just sort of get bigger and bigger, obviously, if you're going for a king versus a crib. We are calling it Hidden Treasure, sort of like X marks the spot kind of a thing. It's super cute, super fun. It would work in a ton of different types of fabrics, but this month we are using Bloom Bloom Butterfly by RJR Fabrics. This is the best-selling fabric line they've had in years, and so they're really excited about it. I'm really excited about it, and I've actually sized the strip sets that go in this so that way you can get full butterflies and hummingbirds in it as well. So it kind of looks like a little bit like a secret garden, a little hidden something or other. So we're going with that theme. Real quick before we get into the actual how to make this quilt, I want to tell you a little bit about Stashing with Stephanie. It's a subscription club that we have where we'll send you 12 fat quarters for the price of 10, so $29.99 a month plus shipping. You get a free pattern to use with that month's fabric, and you get access to all of the previous Stashing with Stephanie patterns that we've released to date. We're at over a $200 value for that, so you get a lot of bang for your buck just right when you join right away for that. And then we also send you coupon codes where you can either get $10 off a $20 purchase, or lately we've also been doing 25% off your purchase if that ends up being the better deal. So if you want to get a finishing kit, you know, say we give you your 12 fat quarters, but you also want your background and enough additional fat quarters and binding to make it king size, we make that easy for you. And with one click, you can have what you need to make this bigger and even bolder. So that is how it works. We ship typically in the middle of the month when our video comes out, and then you can decide if you like it and you want to make it bigger, or if you just want to have the fabric to add to your stash. Let's take a little closer look at the fabric before we get into the meat and potatoes of how to put this pattern together. This is called Bloom Bloom Butterfly by RJR Studios. They are really pushing the boundaries of the number of colors that can be included in any one screen printing design. So it is very saturated with color, but at the same time it has this watercolor feel to the design. So it's got that soft look with really bright and bold colors. I'm really appreciating that combination, especially with these butterfly and flower prints. I think they're just gorgeous. It's got about 4 colorways. It's magenta, we saw it first, and then kind of a light limey green, and then more of a darker green, and then a darker blue. So it's got those great focal prints as well as ones like this, which make great sort of backgrounds and just good to have in your stash. And it just, I just love the pack color that is in here. It's very vibrant and rich and just makes for a really beautiful fabric. And again, we've sized the quilt so that way we're going to be able to have full butterflies and blooms in this, and so you're going to be able to see good chunks of the fabric in design in the actual quilt, so that way we can truly appreciate all of that. It's one of their best-selling lines in a long time, and I can really see why. All right, well, let's get started. This month is all about half square triangles. So we're going to go over how to do that, how to be really precise and make sure we don't lose any of our points. So this is a great one if you are new to half square triangles, or if you're just trying to get a little bit better at them. So we're going to start off with just some simple strip piecing. This is a really basic thing if you've been sewing, but we'll go over the instructions very quickly here. I kind of always paired a darker print with a lighter print just to give it some good contrast when I was working with this, and then I made sure that the two prints were not quite the same. So this one has more of a flower background, and this one, you can see the butterfly there. And again, I sized that. This wasn't fussy cut or anything, but I sized it so that way we could potentially have complete butterflies in here. So I'm just lining this up so that my selvage edges are together, because we'll trim those off later. And I'm just going to lay them right sides together. I never pin this. I just kind of line it up as I go. And I've got my sewing machine set to a 1/4 inch stitch. And just keeping the edges of my fabric, even with the edge of my presser foot, I'm just going to sew down these strip sets. And again, all the cutting instructions for this are available on our website, shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. So what I do is I just kind of lift up like this, and then I will lay it down, and then I kind of have my finger in between to kind of hold everything together. And then I just put my fingertips on top of the two and let the fabric take my fingers up. And then I'll just repeat that process going all the way down to keep everything lined up. So I really like to press my seams open. It gives her a nice flat seam and everything stays truer to size that way. In order to do that, I just open it up with my fingertips, and then I put the center of the iron straight down there. And with 3 fingers down ahead of that, I just kind of finger press that open as I go. I do so with a 2.0 stitch length whenever I do this. And inevitably, somebody always feels the need to comment that one cannot stitch in the ditch when you do this. And to be totally honest, when you stitch in the ditch, you are stitching next to a seam. You're not stitching in the seam. And you can stitch right next to the seam as though you were stitching in the ditch with this. And more importantly, you can get right into the points without worrying about breaking your needle. And I've done this many times. Many of my friends in the industry who are known for the machine quilting do this because it makes for really flat, beautiful joins. So you may have been told that this is not a good thing, but today's sewing machines can handle it. Today's fabric can handle it. It's going to make for much better piecing for you. All right, so I'm going to show you this because I don't always do this, so I did it on camera, so I'm going to show you right here what you need to look out for. I got talking and my seam got a little funky there. It wasn't as flat as it should be. So in order to fix that, I'm just gonna go over it real quick because I want that to be super flat. You don't want to have any pleats or anything. You just want your seam to be super flat on both sides. And because if you have a pleat in here, then your piece is not going to turn out the right size and it won't be as flat as it could be. Just bad things overall. So you just want it to be super flat, and then I usually press from the other side as well. So now we need to trim this into squares. So starting with the selvage edge where I've got just a tad bit hanging off the end, I'm just lining it up so that I've got hash marks nice and even with the seam line. That'll make sure everything stays nice and square. And I'm just going to slice on the side here. And then because this is our first cut and we need to cut off that selvage, I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to get everything lined up again. Nice and square on all my sides, both my bottom, my top, and my side here. And I'm gonna go ahead and slice that again to cut off those selvage edges. We don't need that. Now for all the rest of these, you can just go ahead and cut it to size. So you should be able to see it on camera. I've drawn a line on the wrong side of my background fabric from point to point, and it's really important that you're drawing exactly into that point because I find, especially with newbies, that when you're sewing along here, that it's real easy to just follow your line, and if your line doesn't go to your point, then you're going to have trouble squaring things up later. But what you want to do is draw your line from corner to corner, and then you want to arrange it so that the line is going from the top left to the bottom right, so that way when we pick this up and put it on top of our fabric, when it's going horizontal, it is always going to be orientated the same direction, because this is going to look very different than this. I know it may not look like it right now, but when we go to put the fabric together and you're doing your quilt diagram, it's going to be off and it's not going to look quite right if you have some of them going in different directions. So this is all laid out really clearly on your pattern to go with this, but basically line it up so that your line is going from the top left to the bottom right and that your fabric is horizontal, and you'll be just fine. So now typically when we sew, what we do is we treat the edge of the fabric and we line our presser foot up with that. When we're sewing half square triangles from squares, this one helps keep your bias more stable so that way things don't get stretched out as much. But what you're going to do is you're going to pretend that that line we drew is the edge of your fabric. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew all the way down one side. Then we're going to flip everything around and we're going to sew down the other side, and only then are we going to cut these guys apart, and it makes for much better, more accurate half square triangles. So I'd like to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam when I'm doing this, and to do that I just move my needle one needle width to the right. On my machine that's just pushing a button. You could also just sew a little bit skinnier seam and that would be fine as well. You just don't want it to get too much bigger than a 1/2 inch in between, or your triangles are not going to turn out the right size when you are all done. All right, so I've got everything laid out here, and I have all of my pieces laid out so that the lines are going from the top left to the bottom right, and I've got all of these pieces laid out horizontally. That way I can just grab a background piece, lay it right sides together with my strip piece unit, get it lined up, and be ready to go. So I typically do not pin these at all, but if you wanted to pin them, you would want to pin across the top here and across the top down here. The reason why is it matters very much that your points stay right on top of each other. Whereas if you were to pin over here, this could really shift on you quite a bit. And if your points aren't together to start with, they're never going to be together when we go to trim them down later. All right, so now I'm just sewing down, pretending that that line that I drew is the edge of my fabric, and keeping that with the edge of my presser foot. Now what you can do at this point is you can chain piece them to make it go faster. What I did was I chain piece one colorway at a time. That way I felt like I was making some progress as I was going. I wasn't doing all my blocks all at once. So again, I would just grab those, layer them right sides together, get my corners lined up, or in some cases you might want to pin that if you makes you feel more comfortable. What I typically do is get it started, and then once I'm a few inches in and I can fit most of it on my sewing surface, I do have an extension table on mine, I just make sure that my edges and my corners are still lined up, and I just hold a finger over them, keep them going down. One thing that's really important is you need to be able to maintain your speed and be able to slow down when you come to those points. So this is not a good time to use your start-stop button to get things going, because you have to be able to slow down as you come to here. And then also when I can no longer hold on to that tip here, I just move my finger to the side and help guide that to have a nice consistent seam going all the way down. All right, so when you get all the way down, you don't even have to clip your threads or anything. You can just lift your needle up, flip it around, and I usually pull my thread out just a tad bit, just so it's a little easier to turn everything around. Now I'm going to line everything up again with that line, and we're going to sew down the other side. Whenever I'm chain piecing these, I never want to lie perfectly flat. So you just want to kind of make adjustments as you go. And again, I'm going to slow down quite a bit, make sure I'm keeping that seam nice and consistent all the way to the end. And then I will lift up my presser foot and I will line up the new seam and let the feed dogs take it and sew the rest of the way. Now at this point you want to do a little bit of quality control. What I'm going to do is measure to make sure that I've got a little bit less than, or at least no more than 1/2 inch in between this seam and this seam. It doesn't matter so much that you're exactly a 1/4 inch away from this one, as long as you have a nice consistent straight seam that is 1/2 inch or less away from each other. So to do that, I just line up the edge of my ruler with that first seam, and I can see here that I'm a little bit over 3/8 of an inch, which is perfect. And so that way I'm going to be able to trim this up, and we'll still have plenty of seam allowance, so we won't have to worry about anything popping open. But we're going to be able to sew this and cut it apart and press it. And because we sewed this on the bias can be a little stretchy, but because we sewed it before we cut it apart, it's going to stretch a lot less, and you're going to have to worry a lot less when you get to the pressing stage about things getting a little warped. All right, so at this point, I'm putting my ruler down on that seam, or the line that I drew, and I'm going to try and cut straight down it. Now, again, it's not super critical that you cut exactly on that line, but you also don't want your seam to be too skinny, because it's going to pop open with use and abuse, or even just putting on the long arm to quilt it if this gets too skinny. So you want to have about 1/4 of an inch seam on either side. I actually have an example here of one that is too skinny. I am actually filming this video on the afternoon that I'm going to be induced. So I had a little help getting this quilt together, and one of my helpers cut the seam way too tiny. That is nowhere near a 1/4 inch. And so this is an unusable one that we're not going to be able to use, because if I were to put this in with this teeny tiny seam, it's just going to pop right open when it gets loaded onto the long arm to be quilted. And That's no good. You don't want to work on all this and then have it not work. So you want to make sure that you have nice, consistently spaced seams like this, even if they aren't exactly on the line. So just like before, I'm going to press the seam open. The difference is I need to pay attention to this seam here because I do not want to accidentally press it going in the wrong direction. So when I come to that point, I'm going to actually lift my iron up and set it back down. And I'm going to do that for the rest of that seam. That way I don't accidentally press something going the wrong way. Everything will stay nice and flat. And once I've got it from one side, I'm going to do the same thing from the other. Now it's even more critical right now that you watch out for lumps, bumps, and pleats that might get pressed in when you're pressing it open, because that's going to affect the finished size of your triangle, whether or not everything's going to lay flat in the end. So go ahead and do that for all of your pieces, and we're going to trim this down now. But actually I'll show you real quick here because this is kind of fun. So these are my two halves of the block. So you can see that this one used to be over here. So you end up with mirror image blocks of each other. It's really kind of fun and cool. And this seam is going to be offset just a smidge, about a 1/4 inch or so when you go to put it together, which means we're not going to have to worry about matching these seams when they do come together at next to each other, which there's always a vocal minority who's like, oh, those seams don't match. And it's like, you know what? I have done that pattern. I did it. You have to do paper piecing in order to get these to match perfectly. And the vast majority of people did not want to do that. The vast majority of people like it when you don't have to match those seams and they're supposed to be offset just a little bit. So if you're a purist, I'm sorry, this pattern's not for you. If you like the fact that they're going to be offset just a smidge, have fun. This is going to be a good one. So now we have to trim this up, and trimming your half square triangles is the most important step into getting flat pieces that fit together exactly correctly. And I'm going to show you how to measure, but I'm also going to tell you that you should stand up to do this. I know sometimes we have back problems and it's harder, but you can see a lot better what you're doing and you're more likely to cut everything where it should be if you are looking overhead at it than if you're trying to kind of do one of these and see over the top. It is what it is. As I said, I'm very pregnant right now, so I trimmed a bunch of them sitting down, and they're just not as accurate as they normally are when I trim them standing. So I'm going to talk you through this, and I'm going to be standing for it, but you won't see me standing on screen. You're going to see our overhead camera here. All right, so the most important seam to match up is actually your center seam. You want to make sure that that 45-degree line of your ruler is going straight down, because you want these halves of the triangles to go right into the corner of your square. So if you started off and it's something like this, where the 45 degrees going out into your background, you're never going to have a square triangle because your point didn't start out where it was supposed to be. Beyond that, I make sure I've got some fabric hanging off the sides, and then past the measurement that I need to trim to, and then putting my palm flat on the ruler to keep it nice and steady, and my pinky to the left, again to keep it steady and also keep my fingers out of the way of that rotary cutter. I'm going to cut across the side and the top. So now when I pull that apart, I can see that my point is going right into the corner, so that's a good sign. That means we're off to a good start. All right, so now I'm going to flip this around. And this time I am again starting with that 45 degree, going straight down the center, but this time I'm measuring exactly to the measurement that I need to cut to, because we've already trimmed that off. So now I'm going to trim this guy. And if you're finding that this is getting like pushed up a little bit when you're cutting into here, your rotary cutter blade probably isn't sharp enough and you need a new one. So if you're doing that and this is constantly moving on you, that's probably what's going on. All right, so you can see we did not take too much off of this, but it is enough to make a really big difference when it comes time to actually sew everything together. And you can kind of see the difference when I lay it out. There's not that much, but it's definitely smaller than this one. So if you do not trim, and you know, my corners, these sides aren't exactly square, which is another reason. I know some of the rulers come where it's just like a triangle and you trim it before you press it open, but when you're pressing on the bias, and no matter how careful you are, things are going to move and shift a little bit. So that's why I always like to do it once it's pressed open, nice and flat, and using this method to trim down. Very, very important, very good to have. So go ahead and do that for all of your half square triangles, and then we're going to get together and we're going to sew a row. So there are layout and assembly diagrams for all the sizes of this quilt, and that's available in the pattern, which you can buy or get for free if you're a Stashing with Stephanie member over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. This one is called Hidden Treasure. All right, so I'm going to show you a little bit of the method to my madness. I have one entire row sewn together here, and what I've done is I'm essentially stepping down with my color choices, so that way I don't have to think too super hard about where anything is going to go, but I still have a nice mix of color around the entire quilt. So this one here is the opposite of this piece here. So you can see that in this one we've got our long blue, and in this one it's just short. So for this next one, I'm going to use the opposite of this one here, which is I've got my long green and my short green here. So I'm overlapping these a little bit just because I found it was a lot easier to be able to actually see that these were in fact lining up than to have them right next to each other like this, because it just gets off with that 1/4 inch seam before it gets eaten up into your seam allowance. So I'm just going to continue filling out this row, again making sure that I'm just stepping down from whatever the top one is. I'm going down one to the left, and that works out pretty well for what we're doing here. So I've laid out about half of my row that's going underneath here, which is going to be enough to show you guys how to do this on camera. So again, I've laid it out so that it's kind of directly underneath and these are overlapping a little bit, because I found that a lot easier to just sort of visualize where everything should be. And you're going to see that it looks a little weird when you get to this point. This is the part that kind of forms the X. And so as long as you are aware of where this is happening and where we're sort of changing directions, just make sure you're following your guide. It's not hard, you just have to pay attention to it. So if you have a large, like I just laid this out on my king size bed, one row at a time, and that way it's really easy to kind of pick up and move. And I just kind of had my rows labeled as I got them together, 1 through, in my case, 14. So that way I could just keep it nice and organized, but not have to do it all in one day, because that's hard to do. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to arrange these into sets of 2. So I'm just going to arrange them right sides together. And for most of your rows, you are not going to have any points that match. So you can see we've got a point at the bottom here and here. And the same is true of this one here. But this one, we do have points to match. So I want to show you how to do that real quick. And then we're going to sew these guys together, and I'm going to show you how to assemble your rows. All right, so we want these points to come together. We spent a really good amount of time making sure that our points are going straight into the corners. So we want to make sure that they're nice and pinned together nicely as well. So what I'll do is I'll lift that up, and paying attention to which seam is the seam I'm going to sew second. So we're going to sew down here, and then this half of the seam allowance is always going to be the right half, is what you sew second. So that's where I'm going to put my pin in. So I'm going to flip that over so that it's straight up and down. And since we have them nice and flat, I usually look at this from the top, and it's really easy to tell on one like this because you've got a dark side and a light side. As long as you make sure that your seams are just right on top of each other and that you can clearly see that one is going one direction, one is going the other, it's really easy to just put your pin in, again, that right side of that seam allowance, and that's what we'll sew second. So what you're going to do here is you're going to sew all the way down, and then you're going to stop with your needle down once you hit this half of the seam allowance. So you'll stop with your needle down right here, then you can pull that pin out, because that needle kind of acts like a pin until you can continue sewing. Now this is really important that you pin right where you're going to be sewing. Like I'm pinned pretty much in the 1/4 inch of the seam allowance, because if I were to pin out here or facing in the direction, and basically anywhere where the pin is not coming in right where that 1/4 inch is, all that time we spent lining up, all the time we spent trimming, it's going to be for naught, because this could shift on you when you're sewing. I also do not recommend using a 1/4 inch seam that has a guide on the side, because you're going to have to pull this pin out before you actually get to where the needle is down in this half of the seam allowance, and again, it's not going to work. Those feet are really good for when you're doing like edge stitching for bags and stuff. Not good when you're doing precision piecing, where you have to leave your pins in as long as possible. So I've got 3 of my 7 lined up here. What I typically do is I will grab them all from the side I'm going to sew on, and I will just stack them up like this. And I won't necessarily pin when I'm putting them together. I usually pin as I'm sewing, but this way you kind of know what side you need to sew. And then I'll set this, and I'm going to have my sewing machine right here so I can just grab it and lift, and then I'm much less likely to accidentally sew something in to the wrong side, because that's super easy to do if you don't have a system. One really good way to do it if you're moving like from a bedroom to a sewing room like I was doing is just take a pin and put it in the side that you're supposed to be sewing down. That way you don't accidentally forget from one room to the other and have to go lay it all out again and figure it out. So I'm back to just sewing a regular 1/4 inch seam. And again, if you are a newbie and you want to pin, get your corners lined up at your top and bottom and pin there. You can also put one in the center there. What I typically do is I will take the side that I'm going to sew and I will hold it up and just kind of line my corners up with each other like this. And then I lay it back down on my sewing surface and I will start sewing with that 1/4 inch seam, keeping everything nice and even. And then once I get a few inches in, I will go ahead and reline up those corners and just put my fingertip on top of them and let my feed dog sort of pull up the fabric and my finger along with it. And then when I get to the point where I can't hold on anymore, I'll just hold on to the side with my finger, again, to keep that 1/4 inch seam all the way through. You can go ahead and chain piece these. This is the one that I pinned. So in this case, I just have to line up that top corner. And this is why you don't want to have a guide, because if you had a guide on the side of your foot here, you would have to pull your pin out now, even though we're nowhere near that seam. Instead, what I can do is I can put my finger to the side here and just slow slowly until I get it where my needle is down in the first half of that seam allowance. And now I can go ahead and safely pull this pin because that needle is keeping everything in check. And you can just sew all the way down and that seam is going to be fantastic. Now I'm going to do it with one more of these and just chain piece this all the way through. So again, I would chain piece one row at a time into sets of 2 and then into 4 and so on until you have your row together. And I usually wait to press until the very, very end and then I have my whole row together. So now what I do every single time is I go lay it out to wherever I have my entire rows laid out, usually my bed, and I will lay everything back out and make sure that everything is 1, aligned with the way it should be with my assembly diagram, and 2, that my plan for moving the fabric is the way it should be. So like here I've got those there, and then these are going to form the end of my X, and we're good here as well. So now I can go ahead and I can sew these together and create my set of 4. And from here on out, I don't have any other bits that I have to match, but this one turned out really great. That join is really fantastic. I'm really happy with it and it looks very good. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these together and then we'll press and show you how to get everything together. So I'm going to point out a couple of things here before we start pinning the rows together. This is what I mean by the seams being offset. There is a little bit over probably 3/8 of an inch in between where this seam is and where this seam is, and that is intentional. If you wanted them to match up perfectly, you'd have to paper piece this entire thing, and it's not as fun. But if you are so inclined, there are ways you can drop your own paper piece and pattern and make this work for it. But I found that most people are totally fine with this, especially when you have busy fabric like this. You usually don't even tell by the time it's quilted whether it's off or not. The other thing you want to pay attention to is the edges of your points should be about 1/4 inch away from the edge of your fabric. And that is so when we sew our 1/4 inch seam that our points are going to meet up exactly where they should be. Now, just because they should be there and we've taken a lot of really careful time to pin and everything, that doesn't mean they will be. So I'm going to show you how to line them up so that way even if they're off just a smidge, you'll be fine. All right, so what I'm going to do, you can see right here where all these seams are coming together, it kind of forms a little bit of a triangle. So I'm going to put my hand or my pin right at the tip of that triangle. And then I'm going to find the tip of the triangle on this seam. And really I'm just putting it right smack dab in between those seams there. And this is another reason why I really like having seams pressed open, because you can see this really clearly. You cannot when you are pressing them from side to side. Now I'm pinching this between my thumb and my forefinger so that that pin is going straight up and down in between there. And with the second pin, I'm going to pin in that seam allowance. And again, I'm pinning right where I'm going to be sewing. So that pin is coming in about 1/4 inch away from the edge of where I'm going to be sewing at. If I were to pin over here somewhere or like coming in like this, that would not be as secure of a join because things could slip and slide around on you as you are sewing. So you're going to need to do that wherever you have points coming together, which is going to be the majority of these joins, but I promise you it is so worth it to take a little bit extra time to do that. Now when you come to a seam like this one where there isn't a point on this one, all you have to do is line it up, and in that case I look at it from the top and make sure that my seams are right on top of each other and that they're going in opposite directions just like that. And then I still pin just in the right side of that seam allowance because that's what we're going to come to second, and making sure that that start of the pin is going in right about 1/4 inch away from the edge of the seam you're going to sew. Because I think one seam join where you're going to have to also pin your corners together, but I think it's just one in the middle. So just keep an eye out for that. When the time comes, you may also have to pin on the side. Otherwise, pinning on the corners is optional. You can do it if you feel that you need to. You can also pin in the center of the seams too, but again, that is optional based on your own personal preference. All right, so I'm just sewing that 1/4 inch seam, and you kind of want to pay attention. Sometimes when you go over the little lip of your sewing machine, it can press stuff going the wrong way. So you can always just kind of lift up your fabric a little bit and make sure everything is nice and flat. Now when I come to one of these joins, what I do is I slow down, so that way I'm sewing just one needle width to the right where that teeny tiny little triangle was that we pinned. And once my needle is down in the first half of that seam allowance, the left half, that's when I pull the pin and put that to the side. And again, if you want, you can always pin about halfway through too if you feel that you need to. These did a really good job of trimming all to the right size, so they're all fitting together quite nicely and I don't have to worry about that. So I tend to zoom along until I'm maybe about 1/2 inch or so along, and then I'm just lifting that up again to make sure that my seams are nice and flat and not getting flipped the wrong way. And just slowly sew to the right of that teeny tiny little triangle. Hold a pin and just repeat until you get to all the way down your row. So just like we've been doing all along, I'm going to go ahead and press the seam open, except it's very important at this point to lift and press because there's a lot of seams going on and we don't want to accidentally press something going the wrong direction because then it's not going to lay flat. So I just especially paying good attention to where we have our block joints coming together, really flatten those out really well with my fingertips first, and then put the iron on top. I'm also going to press from the other side as well and just spray it with a little bit of water to help it lay nice and flat. I've said this before and I'll say it again, this is my favorite non-quilting quilting tool. It is a aerosol sprayer. You can put your favorite spray starch in it or your spray starch alternative or just plain water, which is what I use most of the time. And it mists instead of sprays. So you can just hold it down and with one little continuous swoop and get your seam a little moist. And that is a good way to avoid having to put iron or water in your iron. I don't like to do that with this one because it's a fancy iron, and it helps get your seams really nice and flat and sharp, and it'll be fabulous to quilt on. So we can see we took all our time quilting and we have a fabulous join here and here. It's looking fantastic, and you can quilt right into these and you can stitch next to the ditch, which is really all you do when you are folding it over too. You're not right in the ditch or next to it. And I have quilted all along these seams on both sides and in the corners with it being open, and I've never had a problem. So and I know lots of other people who are pros in the industry who do the same thing and they love it, because I would prefer having a point that turns out like this any day over, you know, doing things the quote traditional way, because it just looks so fantastic. So go ahead and do that. Now you have all the skills you need in order to make this. Again, it is called Secret Treasure, and you can get that over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, or if you join Stashing with Stephanie, this is one of the patterns that you can get for free. And again, that's over a $200 value, plus we're going to send you a lot of goodies and deals with your just getting 2 fat quarters for free every month, plus the ability to buy more at a discount, so that way you can get your finishing kit if you want, or just more coordinating fabric. You can do what you want with it. That's fine too. Thanks so much for following along, and until next time, happy quilting.